I wish to make a complaint.
Sorry, we're closing for lunch.
Never mind that, my lad. I wish to complain about this parrot what I purchased not half an hour ago from this very boutique.
Oh, yes, the Norwegian blue. What's wrong with it?
I'll tell you what's wrong with it. It's dead. That's what's wrong with it.
All right, Chris, welcome to part 2, the Parrot Room of the Cutrone Zone. I wanted to tell you a little story from my life and get your reaction to it. I have a roommate, a friend of mine named Jim. He's about 71 years old, and he's living with us, or with me and my kid, because he's just living on Social Security. He couldn't afford the rent anymore. And I asked him what he thought about the UFO hearing in Congress, because this is an old friend of mine. I met him in the 90s. He used to be a writer, screenwriter in Hollywood. He was an actor and comedian in Hollywood. And he was one of the first people to tell me that UFOs were real and that he'd seen them, and he had all sorts of stories about it. We'd smoke pot together and all sorts of outlandish things.
You have not seen a UFO? Is that the deal?
I've never, well, not while I was sober. No, I've had psychedelic experiences, which I attributed to at the time to
alien influence.
But I would not say that I have seen shrooms, LSD.
Right.
In the early 90s.
I have seen UFOs on more than one occasion.
Okay, we should talk about that.
But I don't know what they were.
Right. Well, that
doesn't make me believe in extraterrestrials or even advanced technology hidden by the government.
If you had been on mushrooms, you might believe. But in any case,
I want to believe.
I want to believe as well. But so back in the 90s, when I was playing around with psychedelics and all, I was definitely almost self-consciously just trying to relive the New Left in the 60s.
Yeah.
And it was kind of pathetic at the time. It was like a shadow of what it was pretending to be. But nonetheless, this guy is of that generation, 72 years old.
Yeah.
And so I say, what do you think about UFOs and this UFO hearing? And what do you think his answer was? He says, why are the Republicans trying to push this UFO story? I don't believe it.
Goodness.
Yeah. And I'm like, and I say, well, in fact, it was John Podesta and Harry Reid.
Yeah, there are Democrats who are pushing this too.
Yeah, who got the original government organization together to try to bring
Didn't
forward
Hillary Clinton say that she wanted to reveal stuff if she was elected president?
Right. Chuck Schumer just passed legislation in the Senate to declassify all the.
Why are they doing it now, Doug?
Well, that's the other question. But I just thought it was sort of sad that my friend, who used to be filled with visions of extraterrestrials,
is more terrified into the whole partisan stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I thought it represented a problem for the left, even though he's not really a leftist, but
right.
That this is how we think.
It has implications.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, no, the Republican Party is like fascist. I mean, I've been dealing with this through Platypus over many years. This idea, and check it out, it's even worse than that, Doug. It's the Republican Party politicians aren't fascists. Trump is, but the rest of the Republican Party politicians are not fascists. It's their voting base that's fascist. That's what people say on the left. They say, well, of course, Mitt Romney's not a fascist, but the people who vote for him are. And I'm like, well, that's convenient, isn't it? It's worse, right? It's more than, because I would say, no, all the politicians are fascists and the people who vote for them are not.
Right.
Right? I mean, I would say the exact opposite, but, but that's just me. I'm an old leftist,
Well, I don't know. It was when I was in my 20s, I thought my father was a fascist. Where are these people from who are saying that the Republicans are all fascist?
Yeah, that's what the thing is. They're just rebelling against their parents in the suburbs. They are. I mean, that's the other sad thing. A lot of this stuff. So, we can get into the minutia of value theory. Yeah. But at the end of the day, right, the left and its politics, pseudo-politics, according to Adorno, is very crude. It hides behind a mask of pseudo-sophistication, but its commitments are very base, very crude. And so I assume a kind of broad-mindedness and a kind of humanity and a kind of interest that it probably isn't there for a lot of people.
Right. Or it's only there some of the time.
Yeah, maybe it's there for some people sometime. But I feel like there are some people, I mean, there's a lot of just nastiness on the left. And I'm like, okay, that's why you're here. You're here just to be nasty. I mean, on the right, too, of course. Clearly, the right has a lot of people who are there just to be nasty. But the left, too.
Yeah. What did you think of do you watch the beginning of the Benjamin Studebaker interview? Where I say at the start, I decided I didn't want to do real critical theory anymore for this audience because they don't deserve it. Because they don't.
Well, there's that. I mean, look, we have to appeal to people at their best, not their worst, and kind of despite everything, don't let the bastards keep you down. What is it from the Handmaid's Tale?
Right.
Don't let the bastards get you down. It's hard. It's hard not to let the bastards get you down, but we do have to try to not let them get us down.
No, yeah, I agree. But I did feel like for a while there, if I just could, I just wanted to crack this censoriousness before we moved back on to deeper thinking. Just say, we're for free speech. This is step one. You have to want to think before you can think.
Well, another way of thinking about it is, you got to embrace the dead white men, the Enlightenment, the bourgeois values. That is step one. In other words, if you reject Thomas Jefferson, you reject Marx. That's it.
Oh, of course. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right.
Right? So it's just like, I know Marx didn't personally own slaves or something, but but Engels was an interested party in a horrible factory labor system.
Marx's wife inherited a servant.
Sure.
Right. So that's not slavery, but that's it's
patriarchal misery of some kind. And so
and furthermore, I believe Marx knocked her up. I think I've heard.
That's right. No, that's the illegitimate child who Engels had to raise.
Yeah. So, these people were not saints. They're not. That
may not have been the worst thing that they did. In other words, what else was the family house servant from Germany going to do? Maybe it was better for them to follow them to London and be their house servant. Maybe that was like a better life opportunity than being stuck in Germany.
Could have been. But the point is that, by our standards, judging people by whatever the current morality happens to pretend to be.
By the way, Thomas Jefferson inherited his slaves too, meaning he got it through his wife.
Right.
He didn't have slaves. He married into his wife had slaves. That's how he got slaves. And then he didn't feel that he was free to sell his slaves. Not sell, emancipate his slaves. He was free to sell them. He was not free to emancipate them because he felt like he was disinheriting his children from his wife's wealth and legacy. And he had crushing debts, Jefferson. And back then you could leave your debts to your children, actually. And so he just, because he contemplated, freeing his slaves, and he, out of economics, he couldn't afford to. He didn't feel like it was right to leave his children bereft, like his children just with debt and no inherited wealth whatsoever. And so that's the real story if you want to know. But otherwise, of course, he didn't like being a slave owner. No.
Right. But the point, but go back to the anecdote about the UFOs and all, is that the impoverishment of our imagination right now, the abandonment of old utopian dreams, I think is pretty profound in this current moment.
We're terrified into it. Obviously, especially in recent years, but I'd say generally, there's a historical trend towards squashing. Frederick Jameson has talked about this. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. And and he's also committed to like old style science fiction, and where did that kind of speculative fiction go? Where did the utopian imagination go? So it's observable in the long term in our lifetime. but also like just recent years. I mean, we've been terrified, brutalized into submission, and of course, the first thing that we surrender is our imagination, and the second thing that we surrender is our, like, I don't know, basic humanity. And so we're just like driven into this horrible like rat race maze, concentration camp type behavior towards each other.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a slight overstatement, but not. And I think that it's not as bad as all that throughout all of society, but like you have said in the past. But yeah, it's depressing. And what's amazing to me is, like, for instance, if you compare the America after 9/11 and America after Trump, the left was healthier after 9/11.
Yeah.
And that was actually terrifying. That was a real, attack, and thousands of people
died.
And there was the threat of an anthrax in your mailbox, and, American troops were invading countries, and, there was a tremendous pressure to be patriotic and good American citizens, but it had a right-wing character, a discernibly right-wing character. But after Trump, all of that same kind of all the same demands were made, but they with the left-wing gloss, and it was
the Democratic Party gloss, which I guess is what passes for left-wing.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, it's worse now. I feel like, at least if you're on the left, it feels much.
I mean, look,
worse.
I guess at a basic level, I just do believe, although I have to remind myself of what I believe. I just believe they're just Democrats, nothing but Democrats. In other words, like, of course they don't have a problem when Democrats do it. They only have a problem when Republicans do it, because they're a priori partisan. In other words, they have no principles. Their only principle is that they're Democrats. That's not a principle.
Yeah. But yeah, I guess so. But, I've always been trying to be one of those people who has a principle and not.
No, you were an anarchist. You were a Chomskyan. You were something else.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is, I'm not sure about these young people, because what else is there? Right? And so, like, I mean, certainly the Trump threat has made it impossible for people to do what they did in the 90s under Clinton, which is that after the Reagan era, after Reagan and George Bush Sr., George Herbert Walker Bush, then the left could say, well, Clinton's bad too. All these things that we said about Reagan is also true of Clinton, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's almost like you can't say that now because the threat of Trump.
Right.
And it's like, well, that's convenient, because I don't think that there really is, right? In other words, like, and also, even under Obama, people were like, well, yeah, Obama's continuing a lot of the Bush policies. And, like, there was a criticism of Obama.
There was.
That seems to be gone. And so I think it's very recent. And it's, I mean, it's hard for me to separate.
There's a left critique of Biden, but it's this anti-imperialist left that critique.
Oh, sure. And they're seen as MAGA communists anyway. Right.
And and everything is being characterized that is critical of the Biden administration as right wing.
Mm-hmm. That Trump and the Trumpists are only against the war in Ukraine because they're pro-Putin.
Right.
And it's like, how's that again?
Yeah. Right. I mean, yeah, it's ridiculous. So I want to know if a dialectical approach to thinking can help me and others like me develop a left socialist response to this moment without becoming I don't know, knee-jerk reactionary in the other way, without becoming MAGA communists, or without becoming and also becoming irrelevant in the process, because I do think that's an irrelevant way to behave.
Mm-hmm.
So when you talk about capitalism, getting to socialism through capitalism's contradictions, I get a little worried, because I see capitalist contradictions creating all these very authoritarian forms of.
I mean, the way that I like to put it is, I like to just think back to Adorno, who's my guy, and what he said in, the post-World War II era, but also what he said in like 1968, 1969. So he has kind of famous correspondence with Marcuse on the New Left. And he said, we lived through fascism, the Holocaust, the purges, the communist purges, the Stalinist purges, World War II, and we didn't lose our minds. And so what excuse do these kids in the 60s have to lose their minds over Vietnam? We didn't lose our minds, and look at what we had to face.
Right.
And,
what did Marcuse say to that?
He said, well, yeah, but then Marcuse also said maybe there's a new sensibility, and maybe like the new generation rightfully should not tolerate the things that we tolerated, as facts of life. And, it's not like Adorno opposed that, right? He said, well, sure. In other words, the fact that a post-war generation raised in a different environment might find the Vietnam War intolerable is, of course, a good thing, right? The issue is losing your mind, right? And so what Marcuse said is, yeah, they're kind of losing their mind, but yeah, and it's like a mixture of revolutionary and counter-revolutionary, progressive and reactionary things in the student movement, he said. But, what else is there? What can we do? We only have to try to educate them.
Right.
And, they didn't really disagree over it, right? But I always remember what Adorno said, which is, we had every reason to lose our mind and didn't.
Right.
And part of that is, it's a very peculiar thing, Horkheimer and Adorno, the dialectic of enlightenment. Believe it or not, they didn't think that fascism was the end of the world. In other words, they thought the struggle for socialism continues under fascism. Right? Like, just because which it did. Of course it did, right? The communist parties in Western Europe and the Communist Party in Germany survived. And not to say that I'm endorsing them exactly, but it just shows, and of course it deformed them too. It did deform them. Stalinism is a deformation of Marxism under conditions. It is. And so, I think Adorno never denied that he was deformed by his historical circumstances either. So, but again, the contradiction's not going away, right? So in other words, I think that it just comes down to, I don't know, it's a nice idea. Capitalism is self-contradictory until the chips are down and brutal realities present themselves. And then you just say, fuck that. I'm just against this.
Right.
Right. And I just feel like,
which is what I did with the Twitter files. Right.
Maybe.
I'm just like, all right, this is like, nope. I'm going to, this, if I can do
it's hard because if we're not allowed to debate things,
right,
that's kind of like a limit. In other words, is like government censorship of social media, is it like the worst thing in the world? Of course it's not the worst thing in the world. However, we have to be able to debate things. Right? And, I face a version of that in academia, which is you're not allowed to talk a certain way. You're not allowed to talk about things. And in fact, things are being canceled from the curriculum pretty maniacally. Like things are being eliminated from the curriculum. And it is, well, so-and-so was sexist, so-and-so was racist, so-and-so was homophobic. Like if a thinker ever said anything that could be remotely taken to be homophobic, racist, sexist, they're off the syllabus. It's amazing.
Right. Yeah, they put trigger warnings at the beginning of Kant.
Then you know that something is seriously wrong.
Right, and they did that years ago.
Yeah, they did that already. And now it's not even a trigger warning. It's just forget that.
Yeah.
Right. And so I just feel like that's just, what are we supposed to do? Like we're going to completely.
But for me, the distinction there is like the academic world has the bureaucrats within the academy have the power and the right within this system to set the curriculum, right? They don't, that and if it's a state school, then the relationship between the municipality and the community and the state government and the federal government and what's in the curriculum is complicated. Whereas when you're talking about just, what everyday people express online or try to print, because it's not just a censorship of social media, it is
right. So we can't do the education in academia, but we're also not going to be able to do it in the outside world either. It's like a funny, it's like, well, where is this going to go? It's going to go into some kind of super underground realm,
right.
It's going to become totally obscure. But I guess that's what the Marxists dealt with in the 1800s. I don't know.
We'll create the intellectual dark web for real.
Yeah, right, maybe. I mean, it's just miserable because obviously we weren't raised on this situation, and so I don't feel particularly well equipped to deal with it. No. I'm not trained for an underground existence. I'm from the world in which people could say anything because it didn't matter, right? And whereas now it's like, wait, things that actually are not harmful are seen as like urgently necessary to suppress.
Mm-hmm.
It's very bizarre. And so it's a strange, I don't know. So I think, dialectical approach to the Twitter files. I don't know about that, right? I know that you were talking with Jacob Siegel and it was kind of like, well, we're not going to get rid of these mechanisms. So the only way out is through. And I was like, I'm not sure about that. Because I think, people could vote with their feet. Also, it could create a situation where you have, like, I don't know, actual, like, strife, conflict, political upheavals. And, you could have a situation where...
We said that before the injunction from Louisiana. We said that, before there was... in fact, I hate to say this, but right now, on that issue, it is the Republicans who are putting up a limit around this issue. And there's a possibility that it will be, the RFK part of the Democratic Party will, even if he doesn't get the nomination and there really isn't that many people from his, he doesn't dominate the party, but that sentiment within the party will prevail and it'll be negotiated away, and this will be backed off of, but it will come back. Just like, we have the surveillance mechanisms, we have the censorship apparatus. That part isn't going to just completely be dismantled, just be in the background. We could suppress it.
So the dialectical part, I guess, again, it's not like, I guess, we were talking about this in between the first half and now. There are different levels, right? Different levels of mediation, different levels of concrete manifestation, different levels of phenomena. And so, it's not like a dialectical approach. At some level, it could happen with any phenomenon. Certainly the Frankfurt School and their cultural criticism thought so. But when we're in the political realm, right, it's more like, okay, so where is government censorship of social media self-contradictory? How does it point beyond itself? That's a hard one. But, we'd have to try to think about it in terms of what are the necessities involved, right? The idea that it's a massive society that's technologically mediated and, people have transportation and travel opportunities. So you need these draconian measures in response to a pandemic. And, misinformation is a real threat because there are like time horizons, people have to act now, and there isn't really room for debate or room for people to be too hesitant. Like vaccine hesitancy is going to make the pandemic much worse. And so, it might be unfortunate, but you have to sort of put a lid on it, at least temporarily, until the emergency passes. That, of course, is just responding to exigent circumstances. And, so a kind of civil libertarian attitude might sound nice in principle, but it's impractical. Right? That would be the argument, right? For the technocratic, bureaucratic suppression. It would be like, yes, we should debate the science, but right now we're trying to save lives. Yeah, Okay. Right. And so it's kind of like, okay, but it's a sort of a deeper issue, isn't it? Which is to say, first of all, how effective are these things? Second of
Who's
all,
trying to save whose lives, really?
yeah, certainly,
You know?
and also the effects. I mean, I've suffered health effects from the lockdown. I did.
Yeah.
So I'll probably have lifelong health consequences of being locked down. And so if it happened to me, who is relatively healthy and not too old, I can just imagine how many millions of people have been affected just in the United States. And it's like you weren't allowed to even say that. You weren't allowed to say, like, what about the side effects? What about the effects? Right? Which again, Trump brought up right away, and people were like, "Oh, that's just because he wants to keep the stock market up, because he wants to be reelected."
When the pandemic broke out, we had a book that was submitted to us that I accepted that was critical of the lockdowns, and then our lawyers looked at it. This is at Zero Books, and
Wow.
it came back and was like, we don't think we should publish this. So I was like, okay, and so I canceled the book.
The British lawyers?
Mm-hmm.
That's why.
Yeah. And so I had to say, look, this is not in line with the CDC and the health authorities. We don't want to publish misinformation right now or at all.
So you did it.
I did it. Mm-hmm.
No, I mean, I was in no such position, so who knows what I would have done. In other words, small companies have to watch out for liability. Like, you don't want to be run out of business. Right.
I did not think that I was submitting to state pressure. I thought I was submitting to
doing the right
bosses.
thing. Oh,
and doing the right thing. Both. Okay. Like, we want to do the right thing. I don't want to tell people not to stay in because they should. It was really early days, and also, I don't want to create a legal liability for my company, like you said. I didn't think, this is coming from a state bureaucracy, and it probably wasn't directly coming from a state bureaucracy.
It comes down to a class thing too, right? Which is to say, I'm from a household where there was a necessary worker. He had to go to work physically. He had to be present. Mm-hmm. And so he didn't, and every country, even with the strictest lockdowns, had exceptions for essential workers. And that's mm-hmm. where the virus spread. Mm-hmm. And then they brought it home and it got to the whole family. I mean, that's, so it just wasn't going to work. In other words, it might have worked like they said, like 2 weeks.
But that was the kind of thing that was in this book that we canceled, right?
Right. But the reality of it is that it's class differentiated. Mm-hmm. And there are essential workers, and the essential workers are lower class. They're working class. And they had to go to work. So this whole idea that everyone should stay home, it was never true to begin with. No matter how draconian it just was never actually true. Right? And so it's it's a kind of a monstrous lie, but it's believable from the standpoint of people who don't even realize that there is a working class, that there is physical labor, that mm-hmm. or who are like, oh, but they can wear masks. And it's like, no, the mask didn't protect them. Mm-hmm. It didn't, In other words, the employers made them wear the masks so that they couldn't be sued, but it didn't protect them.
Right.
So
what do you see as like the dialectical approach to 2024? Or what do you see right now as a dialectical approach to the current? This is even better question. We have this left, which is mostly Democrats, but tries to think of itself as socialist. What is the dialectical approach to that?
Well, it's, the critique of the left, and again, I've actually foregone in my own work trying to do a dialectical critique of the left. I've done a historical critique of the left, which is a little bit different. Mm-hmm. Meaning, regression. The idea that perhaps people in the past were better at thinking about these things than we are now. And not even in the deep, deep past, but even just 40 years ago, 50 years ago, but certainly in the deep, deep past, right? And in terms of Marxism as an old relic, right? That we shouldn't assume that we know better. And so just that sort of basic kind of orientation of estranging ourselves from our own situation and sort of seeing the historical long view and not being subject to the what is seems to be urgent immediacies of the present. That's the beginning of a dialectical view because it at least admits historical change, right? And then you could get to, well, how has this history unfolded? What has this process been about? And also, how is this process ongoing? And then you get into the contradictory character of things. So
that second part is really tricky because the way we think about the process unfolding is being constructed historically. Like you pointed out to me with around the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki not so long ago. Like, okay, my interpretation of those events is that they're war crimes. They were part of they were the beginning of the Cold War was in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which is in the Oppenheimer.
No doubt they were in their own way. Of course they were.
Yeah. But you said no, but at the time
they were celebrated by the left.
Right.
They were, as part of the struggle against fascism. Right. And, that doesn't mean that the left was right to do that, but it does mean that we shouldn't be complacent in our condemnation. Right. In other words, we have the moral advantage of saying, oh, look at this horrible thing that happened. And, oh, we wouldn't do the same thing now. Yeah, I'm not so sure that the left would embrace.
Oh, well, right.
Right.
Of course.
I mean, if they had a good reason in their mind to.
I mean, at the moment, we're actually, it is pretty clear that the left very well could embrace the use of atomic weapons,
So I just, I just think that a kind of post-World War II Vietnam era kind of liberal, progressive, revisionist history, like an Oliver Stone perspective, it's fine. Like, it's fine. Anti-imperialism, war crimes of the United States, Hiroshima and Nagasaki among them. But of course, there are other war crimes. Like, you could just say, even short of nuking Japan, look at how the U.S. actually conducted the war in the Pacific against the Japanese.
Dresden.
And Dresden, of course, Kurt Vonnegut back in the day, right? Of course, I was in high school. I read Kurt Vonnegut. I know, and, that's all well and good, right? And I don't, at a certain level, I don't have a problem with that. At another level, though, I think, well, but where did this stuff come from? Where does war actually come from? Where does industrialized warfare, which nuclear weapons are just the logical extension of that, right? It's not like really a qualitative difference between firebombing, finding a technique where you maximize the fuel-air explosive mixture with conventional weapons to create a self-sustaining fireball like Dresden. What's the difference between that and a nuclear weapon? Other than that a nuclear weapon's cheaper and safer way to do it, to do the same attack, right?
Well, radiation.
I know. But, it's like, so Japan was irradiated and it bounced back, and it's one of the top capitalist countries. And Germany was not irradiated. Does that mean it wasn't traumatized?
No.
By Allied bombing, right? So, and did the Allied bombing destroy the Nazis' will to fight? It didn't. The Nazis fought to the bitter end. The Soviets had to go into the bunkers in Berlin and kill every last Nazi, before they were defeated. I mean, and then some Germans were like, oh, let's surrender to the Americans because otherwise we're just going to be, wiped out by the Soviets. But that's the only surrender that happened. Otherwise there was no surrender, and they would have nuked the Nazis. Right, so
they wanted to. They just didn't get there in time.
Yeah, they didn't get there in time. So there is this idea of like, oh well, the U.S. nuked the Japanese out of racism. No, like don't think that they won't do the same thing to white people.
Oh
They
no,
will,
I mean, if you,
you know?
my understanding from watching Oppenheimer, and actually from reading about it, before, and was that the original idea was that Germany was developing the nuclear bomb, and that
Yeah.
the U.S. had to
Yeah.
get there first, and the
Yes.
idea was they were going to use it on the Nazis. That was
Yes. That was
and
the
then
plan. Yes.
yeah, yeah. So
No,
then
I know.
Japan was like, well, why don't we go ahead and use it anyway? And
And there are some Cold War calculations. I wasn't denying any of that. All that I was
Right.
saying is, you know, just it's not just a straight, again, it's politics. You know, war is politics by other means. And politics in capitalism is fucked up. It's brutal.
right.
You know, and it does come down to like violence. It does. And again, it's not like politics is something that we do inside the United States and war is something that we do outside the United States. No, the war that the US conducts when wherever is political in nature. And the politics in the United States are just half a step away from violence. Right?
That's right. That's why I recently was interviewed for Class Unity, this podcast for Class Unity, and I was listening back to it. I don't always listen back to when I'm interviewed because but I was listening back to it and I thought, I'm just saying these sort of Pollyanna things throughout this, what I don't like about the anti-imperialist left is the way in which they embrace a certain kind of realism around world politics, like
geopolitics,
the sphere of influence stuff, and like the socialist project should be to get beyond whether determining whether Putin had a right to invade or not, or and who's right.
Also, it just doesn't say anything about how, like, I don't know, the workers of the world should unite.
Right. That's exactly right. But you say something like that, and I feel like I'm not being clever enough.
Basic.
Yeah, right.
No, well, that's the thing. So, the dialectical approach is simply, I mean, look, so it goes back to, like, I don't know, some basic Hegelianism, which is to say that all the things that we want to morally condemn in the world have a historical necessity to them. Now, the danger in that is that you could become a right Hegelian. You could use it as apologetics. You could use it to rationalize or justify whatever happens. Right?
Right.
And that's not the point. The point is to recognize the necessity, because that necessity is what has to be changed.
Right.
Right? To say these things are happening not out of moral failing or depravity. It can look like that. But there actually is a historical necessity to what's going on. And we need to pay attention to that, because that necessity is what we have to change.
Right.
And it doesn't mean the necessity has to play out in the worst possible ways all the time. The necessity can also play out in better or worse ways. It can. Again, though, the issue is in what time frame. So I know that you got like a patron who complained that I was ignoring X, Y, and Z about Trump's bad policies. And one of the things that was listed was the U.S. scrapping the Iran nuclear deal. And my attitude towards that is, I'm not sure that the nuclear deal negotiated by Obama, and then I'm not being rhetorical, I'm not sure that that is more likely to bring about a peaceful outcome than Trump scrapping it and wanting to play hardball negotiation. Because that's what he wanted to do, right? He didn't want to go to war with Iran. John Bolton did, but Trump did not, right? And so I'm not sure that, easing the sanctions, in exchange for abandoning the nuclear weapons program when the ability to guarantee that that's the case is lacking. I'm just not sure that Trump leads you to war and Obama leads you to peace. I am not convinced, and that's not because of intention. I don't think either of them intended war.
No.
But both are willing to threaten and countenance and are likely to get us into a war. Right? And so, again, if we're not just going to take the MSNBC soundbite talking points and we're going to be serious about this stuff.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Again, I'm not sure that Trump's policy is not the better peace policy. In other words, I'm completely agnostic.
Right. Yeah.
So I'm just I'm not like, oh, Trump's more dangerous. No. Right?
Right.
The other point is, look, as socialists, as wannabe socialists, as people trying to rebuild a socialist left, we don't have a say on these things. We don't. Right? Like, in other words, I might prefer one policy or another, but guess what? The only thing that I can do is, like, I don't know, feel a certain way about it.
You can vote. I
can vote, but you know what? Most of us live in states where the vote's going to go to whomever presidential candidate in the Electoral College anyway. Meaning, I can vote for Trump in Illinois. It's not going to do a damn thing. You can vote for Biden in Alabama. It's not going to do a damn thing.
Right.
It will make you feel better, I guess. But, let's just get real. And so, and our task doesn't hinge on one or the other. It really doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
Our task is not made easier or harder by the U.S. going to war with Iran or not.
Well, what do you think about the anti-war movement or the peace movement in Vietnam or in around Desert Storm or around Iraq or Afghanistan?
It didn't give us a socialist left, bottom line.
Right. Do you think that it had any potential that was missed?
Yes.
Or, yeah, okay.
Perhaps, yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't, it's not like its potential hinged on how anti-imperialist you were.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Right? In other words, it's not a matter of like rhetoric or extreme position or passionate feeling.
Right.
It's not a matter of those things. It's not like being really anti-war in a very passionate and strident rhetorical way gets us closer to socialism than just saying, yeah, war sucks and the capitalists get us into these fucked up situations and we're opposed to war on principle.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, it's not like you have to like go to Hanoi, be Hanoi Jane, and say the people of Vietnam. Because people of Vietnam is fucking Stalinism. It's Stalinism. I mean, which doesn't mean that they're like subhuman and should be exterminated. It just means, I don't know if those are our socialist heroes.
Right. Right.
I mean,
right.
They may not be bad particularly, but I don't know. Does it help us get to socialism here?
I don't know.
Because it doesn't matter. Like with the Taliban too. It's like the Taliban really suck and are definitely anti-socialist, and they're not in any way claiming to be leftist or Marxist. But you could say a U.S. war in Afghanistan is as much a setback for socialism in the U.S. as a U.S. war in Vietnam is.
Oh, I was not a very clear thinking socialist in 2002. I was an anarchist, really. It definitely was. But my reason for opposing the invasion of Afghanistan in response to the attacks of September 11th were like pretty flat-footed, self-interested reasons. Like one, it wasn't the Taliban or Afghanistan that attacked the United States.
Well, there's that.
Two,
right.
Two, the conditions that created the terrorism will not be alleviated by extending a war on terrorism. There's the option of, treating it as a sort of international.
Osama bin Laden's from Saudi Arabia. The U.S. wasn't invading Saudi Arabia.
Oh, exactly. But we weren't even penalizing Saudi Arabia
at all,
or trying to reform Saudi Arabia.
Right. For Al-Qaeda.
So I was like, what we should be doing is trying to alleviate the suffering and democratize Saudi Arabia if we want to deal with our allies, put pressure on the people we don't have to go to war with.
Or more modestly, we could oppose the war policies. We could criticize, in a very strong way publicly, all the compromises that the state were demanding of us.
Oh, yeah.
Right? We could pay attention to the U.S. soldiers' plight. How does the military treat its own soldiers? Because after all, those are the people who we're going to have to be living with for the rest of our lives.
Yeah.
Right? And, I mean, in other words, like adopting a kind of like, oh, the U.S. is Christian crusaderism and the U.S. is just like rapacious, profit-seeking capitalism. And, these kind of like cheap moral kind of things, and not paying attention to the geopolitics and not paying attention to how other countries are implicated, right? And how the U.S. is acting on behalf of other countries. That it's not like American nationalism or something. It's like, no, the world has put the U.S. in this role, and the U.S. is doing it on their behalf. And, like, it's not like, because there's a lot of anti-Americanism in the war on terror. And I just, it's just wrong. It's just like incorrect. It's not like morally wrong. It's just like, this is not what it's about. It's
after the Patriot Act passed, I showed up to a peace protest in downtown Portland with a sign I had created that said "Freedom, not war."
Yeah.
And one of my people in the group, the socialist, a guy from Socialist Action, came up to me and said,
"That's
that's a right-wing sign. That you don't. I mean, that's not going to be read properly by people.
Because freedom is a American nationalist word and right-wing word, and to like I don't know, fascism or something. Right. I know, it's funny, right?
Yeah.
And so, but this is the shit that we get from the '60s. This is the shit we get from the '60s.
Yeah.
Burning American flags. I have news for the children. The Socialist Party, the Communist Party, never burned an American flag and never would. Never, ever would. Yeah. Spartacists were against burning American flags. They were for people's right to do so, because of course people should have the right to do so.
Right.
But they were against doing it as a political gesture because they said the U.S. flag is the flag of the Union in the Civil War.
Right.
What are you doing?
Yeah. Right.
It's the flag of U.S. imperialism, but it's also the flag of the Union Army. Right? In other words, that's your dialectical approach right there.
Right. Yeah, I know. No, I was the kind of anarchist who would be like, yeah, burn that flag. And of course,
and of course the American flag codes, as whatever. I mean, I grew up in the same world as you did. And, it's like if a family had an American flag outside their house, like before 9/11, you'd be like, who are these fucking yahoos? Like, what are they trying to say with that American flag?
Yeah. These days, I want to have...
My family didn't fly a flag.
Yeah.
It would have been too gauche or something. Even for my working class family, it would have been like... I'm surrounded by We Believe in Science. Oh, that shit. Oh, my God.
So, like, and at one point, before my wife left, she was talking about getting a gay pride flag or something. And I said,
although you can do that. A progress gay flag, not a regular gay flag. I know that regular flag is MAGA.
Turf.
A regular gay flag is MAGA. It has to be a progress gay flag, which is super ugly. I don't like the gay flag to begin with. It's ugly.
Right.
But the progress gay flag is really ugly.
For a variety of reasons, my response to that was to say, no, I want to fly an American flag in our yard. I don't want to, if we're going to do anything to stand out, let's do that.
Sure. In other words, right, exactly. Exactly. So, and it's just like, again, I had my adolescent rebellion and I've just outgrown it. Meaning, like the people who are driving F-150s with 2 American flags pinned to the back and, rifles on the rack in the back, they are our future socialists. Otherwise, we're never going to have socialism.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I mean,
but on the other hand, maybe the people who are just driving pickup trucks with nothing, maybe like,
sure. But these are your politically motivated people. In other words, like American patriotism is going to play a role in a socialist revolution. In other words, 1776. Like, God damn it, like the American Revolution, the Bill of Rights, You know?
Yeah, if you know it, right. I definitely believe that if you can't find what you love about the U.S. and about the our history and the kind of freedom that we do actually enjoy in the United States, if you can't find what you like, first of all, you're being dishonest. You're
Right, well,
lying
there's
to
that.
yourself
Yeah.
because you can and you do every day probably. But if you can't find that and express it, then you're saying basically, I'm not a part of this community. I'm not a part of this country.
Right.
I'm actually on the other side against you. You know, it's like, yeah, you don't want that.
Yeah, it's not going to work. I mean, it's not like we have to be particularly expressive about it, but we have to be intellectually honest about it. In other words,
Right.
you do have to sort of, the children have to go and they need to go into seclusion and meditate on this for a little while.
Mm-hmm.
And just think all this leftism, this cultural leftism, just please question it at least. Let it go a little bit. Like just, this, because now we are in a total antinomian phase, I think. Like Trump has done that. Right. It's like, it's made the left into the worst version of itself.
Mm-hmm.
Which is just horrible. I mean, that's why I said why I wish Hillary had won.
Mm-hmm.
Because I hate that. But also, I couldn't have stopped Trump if I wanted to.
No.
So you know what I mean? So we got to deal with it. Fuck. In other words,
right.
It's like criticizing the left's response to Trump doesn't mean that like we're defending Trump. It means we're against this degradation. And we shouldn't feel completely helpless against it. And we should, we got to try to educate and also educate ourselves. In other words, take the opportunity to say, okay, I had my reflexive instincts from being on the left that I didn't question until I was faced with a situation where it's like, I can't afford those knee-jerk reactions.
Right.
Not if I want to think about things.
Have you ever seen the movie Koyaanisqatsi?
Oh, yeah.
And have you seen the film A Man with a Movie Camera?
Yeah, of course.
Those are opposites.
Yeah, I know.
Koyaanisqatsi is this leftism, and Man with the Movie Camera is the actual historical socialist movement trying to express itself. Yeah. And then, so if I have to choose between, I'm going to put a third choice on the table. It's James Brown's music video for "Living in America."
Oh, that's
the middle of the 80s.
Yeah,
which is closer to Man with a Movie Camera by far.
Oh,
than
yeah.
it is to Koyaanisqatsi.
Yeah, which is super romantic.
Right.
Yeah. Super romantic.
Which is why we should embrace living in America.
Yeah.
As opposed to.
I mean, it's Koyaanisqatsi. I mean, it's like a funny that's Philip Glass, or is it not?
Philip Glass was the wrote the music, and it's a guy named Reggio. I think Godfrey Reggio or something like that. He's a priest who. Or some sort of religious figure who created.
It has a spiritual. I mean, and
he's an anarchist. He's a romantic.
Yeah,
anarchist.
I was gonna say I lived through that time too, and so I had my distaste for that stuff at the time, but I also felt the sentiment of it as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, it's not like I just know where it's all led. That's what's hard now. Is that I kind of feel like it didn't have to lead to where we are now, but it did, and that's really unfortunate. Yeah, before we started this, I asked you a question that's theoretical, and I know we are almost at an hour, but I'm going to ask you this question. I asked you I come out of the MHI. I was very enamored with their understanding of the Marxist critique of political economy, emphasizing value theory, not the German version, but a kind of an American version, and
not even Pastone's. Yeah, TSSI, not Pastone's version. Okay.
Who's the Japanese guy?
Oh, I forget his name.
Who I'm talking about.
Yeah,
he's a TSSI theorist.
No, well, there's a guy they overcame who was saying that Marx's critique of political economy was self-contradictory. and they were protecting themselves against that Japanese Marxist, right?
Oh, okay.
So I don't think he was a TSSI guy. They were using TSSI to overcome a critique of Marxism. But in any case, I asked you, how is it that the value theory approach to understanding Marx leads back into tailing the Democratic Party, not developing an independent politics? Why is that? What is the connection? It doesn't seem to me obvious that that it should lead in that direction.
Well, I mean, very simply, the Marxist humanists, the Raya Marxist humanists, are new leftists.
Right.
And so it's just the new forces, new subjects idea, meaning that Raya thought that she was progressing beyond Trotskyism under changed historical circumstances, and that the new social movements represented social progress, societal progress, right? And so I think that while the Marxist humanists would be critical of identity politics, very rarely, but they might have some criticism of identity politics, that really they do consider what comes out of the 60s, whether it's in the Black movement or the women's movement or the queer movement, or in the anti-colonial, post-colonial movement. They do consider all of these things to be progressive in and of themselves. And so, of course, they see Trump as somehow against all those things, as a kind of return of sexism, racism, homophobia. In other words, they follow the Democratic Party line on that. And they would criticize the Democrats for not really upholding those values and not really defending against Trump, right? In other words, they would criticize the Democrats for being insufficiently anti-Trumpist and insufficiently new leftist, insufficiently identity politics in that sense. Mm-hmm. And, whereas for me, as an old style Marxist, I actually see the regressive aspect of these things. In other words, the new social movements are actually regressive. They're liquidating of proletarian socialism. I am a Reedian that way. In other words, I do see these things as the undoing of a socialist movement and just capitalist politics. In other words, the new forces, new subjects idea that Junievskaya had is basically, for me, an apologetics for the new form of capitalism.
And the coalition building within the Democratic Party.
Yeah, and a multicultural, gender liberal, sexual liberal capitalism.
But here's the because and
of course people are like, well, isn't that better than the old kind of 1950s Leave It to Beaver kind of capitalism? Yeah, no, I don't think so. No, not necessarily. No, we in 2023, I'm not. No, right? Yeah, I'm sympathetic to those movements, but I feel like the form of capitalism it's given us now, I don't think it's better than the 1950s form of capitalism. I really don't.
So let's say that I agree with you on that. I mean, I think it's a wash, maybe, but in some ways, yeah. But there was another aspect to Raya Junievskaya, and not just her, but the
the value reality was of the old workers' movement. In other words,
what I would point to is like the Forrest Johnson tendency, or the Johnson-Forrest tendency, whichever it is, the critique of the Soviet Union as state capitalist, which was founded upon a certain understanding of value that,
it's also, it is Trotskyist. It is.
Right. But it was heretical within the Trotskyist movement at the time. It is the basis of their split from Trotskyism.
It agreed with 90% of Trotsky and disagreed with 10%. It's not a fundamental shift away from Trotskyism.
Right. It's shifting away from saying Stalinism was a deformed worker state, which was nonetheless not capitalist, and saying, no, it was actually the value, the law of value still operated. It was still mediated by commodity.
There's a misunderstanding there, because I'm not sure that Trotsky would have denied that the law of value was still operant.
Yeah, well, probably not. Stalin didn't deny it, so why would Trotsky?
Trotsky would not either. And so, again, what you get for this is perhaps more than they bargained for. It's very much like Moishe Postone. And Kleinman has talked about Moishe Postone, and Moishe Postone has talked about Raya Junievskaya. and there's been an acknowledgement of parallels, right? But then they have their differences. So, but let's stick to the parallels. So the parallels are the insufficiency of old, or inadequacy, but really insufficiency of old style Marxism because of its, it's not going deep enough, right? So it's basically only dealing with the sort of manifest social struggles of contradiction at the level of class struggle and the working class, and a kind of traditional kind of labor working class kind of, which, again, neither Postone nor Dunievskaya nor Andrew Kleiman nor Peter Hudis and Kevin Anderson would say that they're abandoning the working class. They would not, right? But they would say you can't be like, I don't know, you can't reify labor or something, right?
You can't focus only on the industrial working class,
right?
Maybe they would say, or, yeah, I mean, it depends on the moment and how upset they were. But yeah,
but that the economic contradiction is only one manifestation of the contradiction, and you have to pay attention to the other things. I mean, by the way, the Stalinists said the same thing in the 30s. So in the 30s, the Stalinists accused the old Second International of being like workerist and economistic, and abandoning basically it's where we get anti-exploitation versus anti-oppression, if anyone knows that language, right? So the idea is that you can't only be anti-exploitation, you also have to be anti-oppression. And so this stuff about class first or not class first Marxism goes back to the 30s, and it goes back to the critique of economism and workerism, which goes back to Lenin. And it goes back to the old Marxism too. In other words, that the Marxist approach to socialism points beyond the economic struggles to wider social democratic struggles. And even, I would say, even though they rarely use this kind of language, but of course liberal struggles too. In other words, they defended the rights of upper class women against sexist mistreatment, right? It's not like they only cared about, right? But they also said the women's movement was under the control of the upper class women, and therefore the socialists have to lead the struggle for women's equality, because otherwise it will be narrowed into only the concerns of the upper class women if it's not tied to the proletariat. If women's struggle for equality is not centered on working class women, then the struggle for equality and against sexism will be deformed by bourgeois feminism, and they called it that in the 1890s, right? And it was called feminism, and the Marxists denounced it as bourgeois feminism, right? So this is like an old thing, but again, how exactly you do that, especially because, again, with the liquidation of that old form of socialist movement, you do get, the disintegration into a kind of workerist economism and a kind of trade union consciousness that Lenin criticized in What Is to Be Done. And you get basically petty bourgeois radicalism in the domains of national oppression or gender or what have you, racial.
Here's something that I've suspected lately, which is that when people within the Democratic Party, people who are on the left who think of their task as around electing the right Democrats, talk about returning to class, what they're talking about is focusing on workers and the labor
organized
movement
labor now.
As a primary constituency within
the
party.
Democrats. Yes, that's what they mean. That's all.
That's
they
what
mean.
they.
That's
right. And so, in
that's
that
not socialist
sense,
either.
Right. In that sense, it actually is workerist in a way,
and economistic. It is.
And it because it isn't trying to transcend the class position. It isn't organizing the working class into a political force. It's saying, within capitalist politics, their concerns are the ones who should dominate as workers. And which workers? The ones who are organized within the Democratic Party already through these unions.
No, that's the thing. That's what's really horrible, because it even betrays its own desideratum, right? Because it accepts the what old style Marxists would call the existing class compromise. Right. And so, again, it's kind of like, look, there's a kernel of truth to new leftism. There is. But it's also not very new, meaning it was there in the socialist movement, the broader socialist movement, and the Marxist approach to that broader socialist movement, meaning anarchists were also not going to be class first, right? Because they cared about all forms of exploitation and oppression, right? So, like, again, we're in this funny conundrum where everything's kind of reified. You know, you reify class, you reify race, you reify gender, you reify sexuality. Everything is sort of like particularized, reified, and you know, it's all kind of fallen apart. And again, it's been a long time that's been the case. And you know, so that's where I kind of feel like, you know, again, my criticism of Junievskaya and that kind of approach, which is informing in Andrew Kleiman, is it hasn't gotten us to the struggle for socialism. Meaning, fine, you made your gamble, right? You tried for a more radical critique and a more all-encompassing politics. It didn't work. Right? And so we need to think about...
But that's so difficult to accept. I mean, and we don't have to just think about Kleiman at all here, because like just looking around at the remnants of the Sanders campaign, the failure to accept what is such a clear political failure, the inability to take stock and think it through again right now is kind of surprising to me. And
that's been with us for a while too, though. So the left turns away from its own failures and really doesn't take it as an opportunity to think back historically, think more deeply, think more long term. You know, they're just sort of carried along. I mean, there is a kind of a demoralization that accepts the lowered horizons, right? Because otherwise it's just too frightening, terrifying. It's even more demoralizing if you don't sort of say, okay, what in the meantime we have to do this, that, and the other thing, right? And I just feel like, well, you know, it goes back to my, you know, conflict with Adolf Fried about the Labor Party, where I just thought, you know, because he's just like, well, this is the best that we could do. And I'm like, is it? I mean, if it had worked, if he had created a Labor Party that replaced the Democratic Party, he'd have more of a case. But I kind of knew it wasn't going to work, and it didn't work.
Right.
And so, you know, that's it. So, but it's the same posture, right? In other words, it's the same thing. You know, we're fighting the right, and it's just basically the latest form of Reaganism or something. And, you know, and there is, I think people get stuck. They do. They're formed in a certain moment, and then they play out the rest of their lives
in that moment.
And, you know, again, I feel like as a teacher dealing with young people, I've really tried to challenge my own assumptions and just say, I mean, and part of it does have to do with the fact that I didn't have like, I don't have a temptation to be nostalgic for anything that I was part of, right? Oh, if only what we were doing had worked. There wasn't anything that I feel like if only it had worked, it would be better, because it wasn't working clearly at the time. It wasn't going to work. Didn't work, you know, and so I had nothing to be nostalgic about. So, you know, that's the difficulty of an actual wave of leftism, namely the millennial left, is that unfortunately they had just enough to be nostalgic about.
Oh, yeah. You know? I get nostalgic for the 90s, but not based on any of the politics. Just sort of like, oh, I was young and
it was a better time.
Yeah, it was better. It was more fun.
I mean, before 9/11, before the Great Recession, before the current kind of Trump derangement syndrome, yeah, things were better.
Yeah, I mean, the left still thought the world was ending. You know, it wasn't.
But, you know, actually, they were more optimistic. Like the social forum left was more optimistic.
Right.
They really were. There was a different, because I think the millennials actually had some of that optimism to begin with. I actually think that they were motivated. I think part of their outrage at the war on terror is that they refused to accept this as necessary.
Yeah, my early experience with the left in my like age of 20 was all within the environmental movement. So there was an apocalyptic quality to.
And probably in the. Were you in the Pacific Northwest then?
Yeah, I was in Portland. So I was. It was like I was working for a lobby organization attached to the Democratic Party called Osberg.
Right. Osberg,
it was,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was. So it was Democratic Party environmental group that would run initiatives and lobby the state Congress, and we went door to door, and they would get students and ne'er-do-wells to go canvass for them, and I was amongst the formerly a student dropout, now a ne'er-do-well, going door to door for the environment, and there was an apocalyptic quality to that, but it was still like we remembered the 70s vaguely.
Well, let's think about that, the climate thing, right? And the environmental thing, because obviously it has changed over the years. In other words, what was seen as the dire threat has changed. So now it's carbon emissions.
It was climate change and global warming even then in like 91. It was still global warming.
Wasn't it also other things, though? Because I remember...
the ozone layer.
Yeah, ozone layer for sure. And there was...
the ocean's dying.
The ocean's dying, right? And that hasn't happened. So when I sort of think, like, all the environmental apocalypse that was supposed to occur has not occurred, and they've actually improved. They've actually restored the oceans. That's why there are all these sharks.
Oh,
and that's where there are all. Is that
these
why
sharks. There's a Sharknado? Is that what's behind the Sharknadoes that are?
No, in all seriousness, when we were growing up, there were less sharks because the oceans have been over-harvested. But now that they're more sensitive to maintaining fish populations, the sharks are back. And not only that, but the whale population is back too.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, that was something people worried about in the early 90s.
Right. And so there are things, and of course, the U.S. has reduced its carbon emissions dramatically over the last 30 years, in fact.
Yeah.
Right.
But this is the hottest summer on record.
Yeah, no, that's just insanity. I mean, I guess I've become a climate skeptic. I mean, at a political level, again, I kind of feel like, trying to starve the working class's standard of living in the name of climate change is just wrong.
No, I agree. I think that I do think that the something around. I mean, I kind of believe that there is man-made climate change to contend with. I've not been convinced otherwise. So, but
no,
and I don't.
There likely is. But the question is, in the United States, like, what can be done? I mean, I think in one of my articles I said, climate change is going to be stopped by Xi Jinping, not by Trump or Hillary or Biden or anybody else, because they're the big carbon emitters, and it's not going to happen because of a moral example set by the U.S. It's not.
No, they'll innovate their way past it.
Right.
Basically. I mean, that's what you said at the time. I recall that.
Right.
I don't know. Like, I just feel I don't talk much about climate change as a socialist because I don't see any socialism developing out of that
movement. Right. That issue, like, not directly, right? Like, in other words, that's not to say that a socialist movement wouldn't care about the environment. It would.
No, right.
But, it's just, I mean, Doug, we're in a bad situation, and so I know that, there are hostile members of the audience, essentially, more or less, who are like, well, what does Chris Cutrone think we should do? Right? He thinks we should do nothing. And I think we have to be realistic about our powerlessness right now. In other words, the only power that we have is over each other. And on the left, and I can tell you it's being egregiously abused.
Right.
And so, I just feel like, all that these issues amount to are reasons for the left to beat up on each other.
Right.
That's what they're using.
Yeah, they're used to turn like, oh, you're for nuclear power. I can't work with you.
Yeah, you're cancel, exclude, silo people into whatever. And, it's just, I guess that's the other thing. It's not like, I don't think this is like fandom, or a subculture or like, niches of like, market segmentation. Like I think that the stakes of the left are bigger than this. And so it's not some kind of taste society or opinion mongering. It really isn't. And so everything that is immediately before us are only occasions to think about things. And our polarization over these things really doesn't matter very much. It's more basic to how we think about things and our overall general approach, like our overall perspective on things, because there's a lot of room for legitimate disagreement.
Yeah. I've wanted for a while to get to the point where there's a kind of left-wing current where the most exciting thing is for there to be a disagreement and a lively argument about it. That, and that where you listen to each other, you're not just trying to smash each other in the argument, but since in the last few months, I've gotten to a point where all I really care about doing is smashing home one little point over and over again. I need to break it, which is like we have to oppose.
No, freedom of speech is important. Freedom of speech is important, and it is important because rational debate is important. Critical thinking, consideration of different things, different sides of arguments, including look, in terms of ideology critique, in terms of Marx and Marxism, and certainly, the Frankfurt School, one has to find the rational kernel in right-wing ideology. In other words, again, it's necessity. Why does the world look this way to people? Why is it at all plausible? What is this about? And that's not just about populist grievances, nor is it about the most arcane fringe ideology either.
Right.
But just thinking, okay, what is going on here? What are people striving towards? What are they grasping for? What do they want out of whatever, whether theoretically or practically, their kind of ideological worldview or their political commitments? And, and again, seeing it as a symptom of capitalism, and not falling into a kind of an easy moralism with regard to this. And discontent, striving for freedom, finding the current situation oppressive in some way, because clearly there is a lot of discontent and people do find these things oppressive. And, and maybe that's being voiced on the right now because the left can't afford to or something.
But it can.
It can. And also, we're on the left. And so we're expressing, right?
Right. Exactly.
And there is an audience for this. And, and so, again, just the Trump moment is a moment for us to realize that the old political spectrum, I was thinking about this, how just a few years ago, it was that two axes.
Yeah, the compass.
Authoritarian and libertarian, right? And that kind of thing was like a thing. And I feel like that's gone. Isn't that curious? That's just gone.
Yeah, you don't see those anymore. People aren't putting themselves on that compass anymore. And
it's because, again, they're not even thinking that much about it anymore. It's either you're left or you're right.
Right.
Yeah. Libertarian authoritarian's out the window, first of all. So it's become one-dimensional, not two-dimensional. And it's not even a spectrum anymore.
Yeah.
You're a crypto right-winger. You're either a good leftist or you're a crypto right-winger. There's no spectrum.
Right.
And so it's amazing because that shit used to annoy me. That two axes, I thought this is just nonsense. And it got to a point where they would make fun of it, right? And then I thought, okay, at least we can make fun of it now, right? But now it's just gone.
Right. Be careful what you wish for. It's always the.
I know, right? Because I really was annoyed by it because and then Overton window type stuff. I really hate that stuff. But even that, no one's talking about that anymore.
Right. No. Right. The Overton window is dead. The political compass is dead.
Yeah.
You're either with us or you're against us.
Yeah. It's super authoritarian to get back to what we were talking about this week. Meaning, one thing I forgot to mention about authoritarianism, black and white thinking.
Right.
Black and white thinking, either or, no tolerance for shades of gray, no tolerance for nuance or complexity, right? Black and white thinking, either or.
This is why the Barbie movie and Oppenheimer together, it was so depressing for me, because it was the most, in both cases, very black and white thinking, very, binary kind of thought. And of the two, Barbie was better, which was astounding to me.
Yeah. Wow.
Even though it was jam-packed full of Hillary Clinton kind of style feminism, it was also poking fun at that, as it went along. And it was fun to watch. And Ryan Gosling made me laugh. And there was nothing in Oppenheimer that made me feel
it was dire. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway.
This is the thing. And people don't understand that, again, just basic psychology, and maybe it's because they don't know that there's any other way to be.
Well, I think it's not. I think there's a pocket. There are little pockets of, resistance, left socialist resistance, little pockets of it still.
I hope so.
And but what we have to prepare for is this coming election. We have to be ready to withstand the storm, because it's coming. I think this is just a lull.
I've already trained myself. I'm 7 or 8 years down this highway. Mm-hmm. And so I'm watching my Trump speeches again, and I'm laughing along, and, it's like, this is the way I'm going to get through it, right? Is to watch the Fox News personalities making fun of Joy Behar enthusing over Jack Smith being an Ironman competitor. He's a triathlete.
Yeah.
So the Fox News people are like, yeah, she's just rubbing his abs in her mind. This is our hero, right? And this is how I'm going to get through it, because otherwise it's kind of terrifying, to look at rabid bureaucratic prosecutors, unleashed, right. Because again, I feel like, of course, I mean, look, I am a leftist, meaning that I see myself as a victim of the police, a potential victim of the police, right? In other words, when I see this kind of action, this kind of prosecution, this kind of police action, I think I'm on the other end of it.
Right.
This is never on my behalf. Right. I'm always a potential victim of it.
Yeah.
And because I don't know, I mean, I guess I feel like I have sympathy for anyone who I feel is being treated unfairly. And I feel like anyone in power is predisposed to treat people unfairly.